Welcome back. Tonight, we are telling the complete legend of King Arthur, from the secret of his birth to the founding of Camelot, through the glory of the Round Table, to the betrayal that ended it all, and Arthur's final, quiet journey to the Isle of Avalon. It is one of the oldest stories Britain ever told itself. Settle in, get comfortable, and let it carry you through the night. Our story begins in a Britain without a king. The old ruler had died without an heir, and the great lords of the land were already circling one another, each certain the crown belonged to him. Into that uncertainty rode a duke named Gorloy, and his wife, Igraine of Cornwall, whose beauty was spoken of in every hall in the land. When the High King, Uther Pendragon, saw her for the first time, he could not look away, and could not stop thinking of her afterward. Uther was not a patient man. He was a warrior, used to taking what he wanted, and what he wanted now was Igraine. Gorloy, sensing danger, took his wife and fled to the coast, shutting her away in the cliff-top fortress of Tintagel, where the sea crashed on three sides and no army could easily follow. Uther, furious and lovesick in equal measure, turned to the one man clever enough to help him. Merlin, the enchanter, half made of old magic, who had already begun to see, in the shifting of his visions, the shape of a future king that Britain badly needed. Merlin agreed to help Uther reach Igraine, but only for a price. Whatever child came of that night would belong to Merlin, to raise and guide as he saw fit. Uther agreed without hesitation. Merlin worked his enchantment, and for one night, Uther wore the face and voice of Gorloy himself, and rode into Tintagel unquestioned. Igraine, believing her own husband had returned to her, welcomed him in. That same night, unknown to her, the real Gorloy died in a skirmish some miles away. And so a child was conceived in a deception that would shape the rest of his life before he had even drawn breath. When Igraine's true husband was confirmed dead, Uther revealed himself and soon married her, and in time, she bore a son. True to the bargain, Merlin came for the boy almost as soon as he was born, and carried him away into the night to be raised in secret, far from the court, by a good and quiet knight named Sir Ector. The boy was named Arthur, and he grew up not knowing he was anything more than Ector's second son, a boy who fetched, and carried, and served his elder foster brother, Kay, without complaint. Uther Pendragon ruled for some years more, but he made many enemies, and in time he too died, leaving Britain once again without an heir that anyone could agree upon. The great lords gathered in London, bristling with ambition, each certain that he, and no other, deserved the crown. It was Merlin who proposed the test. In the churchyard of the greatest cathedral in London, a sword appeared, driven deep into a stone, and upon the stone were carved words that everyone could read but no one could satisfy. Whoso pulleth out this sword from this stone is rightwise king born of all England. Every great lord in Britain tried. Dukes strained until their faces reddened. Kings who ruled provinces twice the size of London heaved with both hands and felt the sword not move an inch. Year after year, on the appointed days, they came and tried and failed, and the sword sat waiting, patient as stone itself. It was not ambition that finally drew the sword, but a small, ordinary mistake. Arthur, now a young squire of no particular importance, had come to London with Sir Ector and Kay to watch a great tournament. Kay, in his hurry, realized he had left his own sword behind at their lodgings, and sent Arthur running to fetch it. But the lodgings were locked and empty, and Arthur, not wanting to disappoint his brother on such an important day, remembered the sword standing in the churchyard, and thought no one would mind if he borrowed it for an hour. He had no idea what it meant. He simply pulled it free, as easily as drawing a blade from soft earth, and carried it back to Kay. Kay knew that sword at once, and in his surprise, very nearly claimed the deed for himself, before his own conscience, and his father's sharp eye, forced the truth out of him. Arthur was made to place the sword back into the stone, in front of witnesses, and draw it out again, which he did, easily, while grown lords who had strained for years stood by in silence. Even then, many refused to believe it. Surely this boy, this squire, this nobody, could not be the rightful king. The test was repeated at every great feast for almost a year, and every time, only Arthur could draw the sword, until at last, grudgingly, resentfully, the lords of Britain knelt. The early years of Arthur's reign were not easy ones. Many of the old lords who had failed the test rose up against him, unwilling to be ruled by a boy who, until recently, had been fetching swords for his older brother. Arthur fought them one by one, and in these wars, Merlin stood always at his side, guiding him, warning him, teaching him the old wisdom that a king needs as much as courage. In one of these battles, Arthur's first sword, the one drawn from the stone, was broken in combat, and Merlin led him instead to a still, silver lake, where a hand rose from the water, wrapped in white samite, holding aloft a second, greater sword. This was Excalibur, given to Arthur by the mysterious Lady of the Lake, its blade said to be unbreakable, its scabbard enchanted so that whoever wore it could never bleed to death from any wound. Slowly, painfully, Arthur won his kingdom. The rebellious lords were defeated or reconciled, and Britain, for the first time in a generation, had a single, undisputed king. And with peace, at last, came the chance to build something new. Arthur married Guinevere, daughter of King Leodegrance, a woman as celebrated for her grace as for her beauty. As part of her dowry, her father gave Arthur a most unusual gift, a great round table, built so that no man seated at it could claim a higher seat than any other. There would be no head of the table, no place of greater honor, only a circle of equals, bound together by oath. Arthur saw at once what it could become, and around that table he gathered the finest knights in Britain, and beyond, men who swore to protect the weak, to speak the truth, to show mercy to those who asked for it, and to never fight in a cause that was not just. From this table, and this oath, Camelot was born, not merely a castle, but an idea that strength should serve goodness, and not the other way around. The knights who gathered there became legends in their own right. There was Sir Kay, Arthur's foster brother, sharp-tongued but loyal to the last. There was Sir Bedivere, steady and quiet, who would one day carry the heaviest burden of the whole story. There was Sir Gawain, Arthur's own nephew, famous for his strength that grew mightier as the sun climbed toward noon and faded as it set. And then, one day, riding into Camelot from a land of mist and enchantment, came a young knight named Lancelot du Lac, raised since childhood by the very same Lady of the Lake who had given Arthur his sword. Lancelot was unlike any knight Camelot had seen. In the tournament field he was unbeatable, and in his heart he carried the same ideals Arthur had built the Round Table upon, so completely that the two men became, almost at once, the closest of friends. Arthur trusted no man more. It is one of the saddest ironies of this whole story that the friendship between Arthur and Lancelot was as real and as deep as any friendship in it, right up until the very end. Camelot's early years were golden ones, remembered ever after as a kind of high summer that Britain never quite saw again. Merlin still walked the halls as adviser and protector, though even then his visions troubled him, glimpses of a fate he could see coming but could not quite prevent. It was in these years that many of the Round Table's most famous adventures took place, tales told and retold at every fireside since. There was the strange challenge of the Green Knight, who rode into Camelot one midwinter feast and dared any man to strike him a single blow, on the promise that he would return it in kind a year later, a challenge that young Gawain accepted with more courage than he perhaps understood at the time. There were quests to rescue captured ladies, to defeat giants who terrorized the countryside, to humble proud knights who had forgotten the oath of the table. Through it all, Arthur ruled with Guinevere at his side, and Camelot became a beacon, a place other kingdoms measured themselves against and always found themselves wanting. But even in these golden years, a shadow was already growing, quietly, the way a single crack can grow in a stone long before anyone hears it break. Lancelot, Arthur's dearest friend and greatest knight, found himself falling in love with Guinevere, Arthur's own queen. And Guinevere, for all her grace and her genuine devotion to Arthur, found herself returning that love. Neither of them chose this. It arrived the way weather arrives, slow and then sudden, and for a long time they said nothing, did nothing, and told themselves it was simply admiration, simply friendship, simply the closeness that comes from serving the same king and believing in the same ideals. It was not enough to break anything, not yet. But it was there, quiet beneath the golden surface of Camelot, waiting. It was into this uneasy calm that the greatest of all the Round Table's quests began. One evening at the Feast of Pentecost, as the knights sat together in their accustomed places, a blinding light filled the hall, and through it passed a vision of the Holy Grail itself, veiled and radiant, filling every man present with a hunger they could not name. In that single moment, as one, the knights of the Round Table rose and swore a solemn vow, to leave Camelot and search the width of Britain and beyond for the Grail, however long the search might take, however far it led them from home. It was, in its way, the beginning of the end, though none of them could have known it. The knights scattered in every direction, and the quest tested each of them in ways the tournament field never had. Many failed, undone by their own pride, or anger, or old unconfessed sins, and returned to Camelot quietly, having seen visions of the Grail they could not come near, let alone touch. Lancelot, for all his skill and all his courage, was among them. Time and again he came close to the Grail's presence, only to be turned away, gently but firmly, by his own unrepented love for Guinevere, a truth he could no longer hide even from himself. Only 3 knights proved worthy enough to complete the quest entirely. Sir Bors, steady and humble. Sir Percival, innocent and true-hearted. And Sir Galahad, Lancelot's own son, born to a purity his father had never quite managed, who alone among all the knights of the Round Table was permitted to look upon the Grail directly, and who, having done so, did not wish to return to the world at all, and passed from it in peace and radiant joy. Camelot that welcomed its knights home was a quieter place than the one they had left. So many good men had died or vanished on the quest that the fellowship of the Round Table was never quite whole again. And into that stillness, the old, unspoken love between Lancelot and Guinevere, tested by absence and unable to hide any longer, deepened past the point either of them could pretend it away. There were those in Camelot who had long suspected the truth, and among them was Sir Mordred, a knight whose parentage was as tangled and as troubled as Arthur's own, and whose ambitions for the throne had been quietly growing for years. Alongside his kinsman Sir Agravain, Mordred set a trap, catching Lancelot in the Queen's chambers and raising the alarm before the whole court. Lancelot fought his way free in the chaos that followed, but in doing so, he killed several knights of the Round Table who tried to stop him, men who had once called him brother, among them the young and much-loved Sir Gareth, who had not even been armed, and who Lancelot struck down without recognizing him in the confusion and the dark. It was a wound that would never fully heal. Gareth's own brother, Sir Gawain, who had loved Lancelot as a friend for years, could not forgive it, and turned against him utterly. Guinevere was condemned to be burned for her betrayal, as the law of the land demanded, and it was Lancelot, in one final desperate act, who rode to the stake and rescued her at the very last moment, carrying her away to his own stronghold. Arthur, whose heart was broken in ways that had nothing to do with kingship, was left with an impossible choice. He still loved Lancelot as a friend. He still loved Guinevere as his queen. But the law had been broken in front of the whole realm, and a king who ignored that could not remain a king for long. Pressed by Gawain, still grieving and furious over his brother's death, Arthur gathered his armies and rode to lay siege to Lancelot's castle in France, leaving Britain, and the throne, in the hands of the one man who had been waiting all along for exactly this chance. Sir Mordred. While Arthur's attention and his armies were fixed across the sea, Mordred moved quickly. He declared to the people of Britain that Arthur had died in battle, seized the throne for himself, and even attempted to force Guinevere into marrying him to secure his claim, a plan she refused with everything she had. Word of the betrayal reached Arthur in France, and he abandoned the siege at once, Gawain reconciling with him in these final days, forgiving Lancelot at last with almost his final breath before dying of wounds reopened on the journey home. Arthur returned to Britain to find his own kingdom, the kingdom he had built from nothing, from a boy pulling a sword from a stone, now turned entirely against him, led by a man who was, in every way that mattered, his own blood. The armies of Arthur and Mordred met at last on a field called Camelot, and it was there, on that field, that the story of Camelot ended. It is said that Arthur and Mordred had agreed to a truce, and that the battle began by pure and terrible accident, a soldier drawing his sword to kill a snake that had bitten him, a flash of steel misread by two nervous armies as the signal to attack, and once begun, the slaughter could not be called back. By the day's end, nearly every knight of the Round Table lay dead upon that field, the golden fellowship that had once seemed as though it might last forever, gone in a single afternoon. Arthur himself found Mordred amid the carnage, and the two struck one another down together, father and son, king and traitor, each unable to leave the other standing. Arthur did not die at once. Grievously wounded, he called for the one knight still living at his side, faithful Sir Bedivere, and gave him a final task. He was to carry Excalibur to the edge of a nearby lake and cast it into the water, returning the sword to the place from which it first came. Twice Bedivere went to the water's edge, and twice his courage failed him, the sword too beautiful, too precious, to simply throw away, and twice he hid it instead and returned with a false report. But Arthur, weakening, saw through the lie both times, and sent him back a third time, and at last Bedivere obeyed. He hurled Excalibur out over the water, and as it fell, a hand rose up from the lake, wrapped in white samite just as it had been so many years before, caught the sword by its hilt, and drew it down beneath the surface, gone as completely as it had once appeared. When Bedivere returned to Arthur's side, he found a barge waiting at the water's edge, draped in black, carrying three mysterious queens robed in mourning. Gently, they lifted the dying king aboard, and the barge pushed off into the mist, carrying Arthur away from the battlefield, away from Camelot, toward the Isle of Avalon, a place beyond the edges of any map, where it is said his wounds might finally be healed. Bedivere watched from the shore until the barge, and the king, disappeared entirely into the fog, and he was the last man of Camelot ever to see Arthur go. No one ever found a grave. No one ever confirmed a death. And so, over the long centuries since, the story has been told and retold not as an ending, but as a kind of promise. They say Arthur sleeps still in Avalon, healing, waiting, and that should Britain ever face a danger great enough, dark enough, he will wake, and cross the water once more, and come home. The once and future king, they call him, a title that means his story was never truly finished, only paused, resting somewhere beyond the mist, the way any of us might rest after a long and difficult day, waiting quietly for morning. That is the whole of it, from the sword in the stone to the sword returned to the lake, from a boy who did not know his own name to a king remembered for 1,000 years. Camelot rose, and shone, and fell, the way all bright things eventually do, but the ideal at its center, that strength should serve kindness, and the strong should protect the weak, outlived every stone of that castle. Let the story settle over you now, quiet as mist over water. There is nothing more to do tonight but rest. Somewhere, in the old telling, a king still sleeps in Avalon, healing slowly in the dark. Let yourself do the same. Rest now. Drift. Sleep.